1878, a group of former slaves called Exodusters experienced segregation in the American South, so they decided to explore a new land and new ways of living. They were enticed to go to Kansas. Upon arriving, the Exodusters encountered challenges and successes on the prairie. They exchanged correspondence with family and friends in the South. Their stories of their successes over these new challenges encouraged other groups of former slaves to move elsewhere, as a small part of the Great Migration, where millions of African Americans moved north, inspired to start a new life as the Exodusters had. The time after the Civil War, called the Reconstruction period, often didn't lead to a better life for freed African Americans. They worked to improve their lives by trying to buy their own land to live on. Northern troops had helped to create a safer environment for the former slaves, but the Compromise of 1877 removed the Northern troops from the South. Often, freed slaves ended up on plantations of their original owners. The Southern states set in place Jim Crow laws that discriminated against African Americans, even though they were now free from slavery. Many became sharecroppers, barely able to survive.
Oh, sharecroppers was bad for everyone because it's like now, what is it? I own my soul to the company store. Literally, you did, because sharecropping took you backwards into slavery.
Many former slaves decided to explore a life outside of the South. Benjamin Pap Singleton, an African-American activist, businessman, and former slave, encouraged them to move to Kansas because of the free land there due to the Homesteading Act of 1862. Anyone could move to Kansas and get 160 acres of land for free if they worked it for 5 years and were a citizen of the United States of America. The idea of an all-black town was what encouraged large groups to consider moving. Some wanted to go to Liberia, but the majority of the former slaves decided to move west. The former slaves, soon to be called Exodusters, started their journey to Kansas and the surrounding area in 1878. Like the Israelites in the book of Exodus, they explored a new land, only in this case the dry, dusty American West. Real estate promoters, such as W.R. Hill, promised established towns for the former slaves, such as Nicodemus, Kansas. Upon arriving at their destination, they realized the towns weren't established as promised. There were only small settlements and the open prairie. Many people stayed to create communities, although a few moved on, choosing to work in larger towns in eastern Kansas. The ones that stayed had to learn to work on a land very different from Kentucky. The soil was different from the southern soil, which was rich and fertile. Kansas was very dry and difficult to grow crops on.
It was a challenge for everyone, but especially for Exodusters who never had left the South before, and here they were free to move about the country. They didn't know where to go, or even so much where to go. And here they were out on their own, trying to survive on their own, some with help and some without, but it was because the biggest challenge was finding somewhere to go, and what do I do now that I'm free to move about the country. Mrs. Hickman, who when she arrived here, she left Kentucky where there was plenty of trees, moist soil, coming out to Kansas and finding there's nothing out here. They had been told that this was the land of milk and honey, plenty of trees, plenty of wild animals for farming and food, and coming out finding nothing here. That was a big disappointment for her and several other people, but with hard work and determination, they made the town work.
The Exodusters encountered many challenges, but also found ways to thrive with the help of their neighbors and the Kansas Freedmen's Relief Association, a group that helps support Exodusters that moved to Kansas. They worked with neighboring settlements to learn skills that would help them survive on the prairie. They learned how to use fertilizer and to make water diversion channels. Their neighbors were mainly white, but because they were all working under the same harsh conditions, their skin colors mattered less. Very few towns or settlements set in place laws that would discriminate against African Americans. A few Exodusters would move into nearby towns and work as apprentices to make money for supplies their families needed. Once towns were established, and during the process of creating them, many Exodusters wrote back to their relatives or friends in the South, telling them about their new life in Kansas. In these letters, they told about their experiences on the prairie and asked for more former slaves to come and join them in their settlements. As Exodusters exchanged correspondence with family and friends back home, other groups of relations decided that it may be good to move away from the South. Letters from Exodusters stated that even though life was harsh, it was better than living like they had as slaves or sharecroppers. As more letters arrived from relatives and friends, sharecroppers decided to move to other places to create a better life for themselves. Because of Jim Crow laws, African Americans had no opportunity in the South. Not only did more former slaves move west, but they also moved north to cities like Chicago and New York City. This migration was the beginning of the Great Migration, which consisted of millions of African Americans moving out of the South to escape segregation and start anew. The Exodusters didn't only encourage other African Americans to move out of the South, they also helped boost the economy of Kansas and the rest of the western states. Some Exodusters and their descendants decided to move off the prairie and into larger towns where many got jobs that required manual labor. Many took manufacturing jobs that helped boost the economy.
So when the former enslaved came to Kansas, they helped increase the number of people who was here, so therefore they purchased goods as well as help start towns to grow. So yes, they attribute to the economy in that way.
Although all the towns but one, Nicodemus, Kansas, failed because of people moving into larger cities, descendants of Exodusters are still spreading their culture and southern roots around Kansas. Every year, Nicodemus hosts a celebration where descendants of Exodusters gather together to share their histories. The descendants of Exodusters are now spread throughout the United States, living in many different places other than the prairie. Only one surviving town, Nicodemus, has a small community of African American descendants still living there. After the first group of Exodusters came to Kansas in 1878 to explore new ways of living, they exchanged word with relations, inspiring others to move from the South to create communities of their own elsewhere. That migration impacted the economy of the West and spread African American culture throughout a new part of the country.
Now read 'em, John.
Read 'em.
Read 'em, John.
Read 'em.
Read 'em, John.
Read 'em. Read 'em. Let me go.
Now read 'em, John.
Read 'em.
Read 'em, John.
Read 'em.
Read 'em, John.
Read 'em. Read 'em. Let me go.